President.
The Senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, I rise today to urge my colleagues to reject this resolution to roll back accountability for the billions of dollars that are sent to states to help educate children. When Congress updated the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 2015, it was a bipartisan achievement. Republicans and Democrats came together on the 50th anniversary of that landmark civil rights law to rewrite it into what became the Every Student Succeeds Act. When President Obama signed this K-12 legislation into law in December of that year, he called it a Christmas miracle. It received 85 votes in the Senate. It was one of the most important pieces of bipartisan legislation passed in the last Congress. It wasn't the bill I would have written, but it was a bipartisan compromise. It gave states and districts far more flexibility when it came to improving their struggling schools. At the same time, it maintained critical civil rights and accountability protections to ensure that when the federal government gives states billions of dollars to improve the education of their students, that the money goes to the schools and students that need those federal resources the most. It was a critical step toward making sure we are building a future, not just for some of our kids, but for all of our kids. When Congress passes big, complex laws like the Every Student Succeeds Act, it always leaves some of the implementation details to the agency that has to enforce the law. And that's why I fought hard to make sure that the Department of Education had the tools it needs to rewrite clarifying rules and guidelines to enforce the Every Student Succeeds Act. This was a condition of my vote and the votes of lots of other people. We won that fight. The authority to enforce the rules is right there in the law. It was debated in public, and it was part of a bipartisan agreement between Republicans and Democrats. And last November, the Department of Education, after careful consultation with teachers, with school leaders, with state education leaders, and with parents, issued new rules to enforce this law. And today, congressional Republicans are trying to take a sledgehammer to these new rules. When these new rules were issued, everyone who works in education agreed they were critical and necessary. Teachers were fine with the new rules. State education leaders were fine with the new rules. Civil rights leaders were fine with the new rules. Everyone was ready to get to work. Apparently, congressional Republicans do not care. Instead, they want to blow up these critically important accountability rules, even though the people who work, in or around public education did not ask them to do so. This makes no sense. Groups that often disagree with each other over public education policies are united in their belief that this resolution is a dumb idea. It is opposed by teachers, opposed by civil rights organizations like the NAACP and the National Council of La Raza, and opposed by organizations representing students with disabilities, like the National Center on Learning Disabilities. It is opposed even by the United States Chamber of Commerce, because they know this resolution will only make it more difficult for states as they try to implement the new education law. And this resolution will undermine the work that states are currently doing right now to improve their public schools with the new law. Last week, many of these groups signed on to a letter that states, and I quote, "This action will cause unnecessary confusion, disrupting the work in states and wasting time that we cannot afford to waste." In fact, even conservative education policy experts at the Fordham Institute, a right-leaning educational policy think tank, argue that congressional Republicans should not swing a wrecking ball to these guidelines. They identified over 20 provisions in these rules that actually provide more flexibility to states by clarifying ambiguous sections in the law. And they concluded Senate Republicans then should scrap their plan to use the Congressional Review Act to kill all of the accountability regulations outright. Killing these new rules now would lead to chaos and confusion. just when states and districts and school leaders are beginning to implement this new K-12 education law. States have already spent months drafting their plans for complying. 18 states, including Massachusetts, intend to submit their implementation plans to the Department of Education next month. If this resolution passes, all of that work will be thrown into limbo. These clarifying rules include important provisions that allow states to send additional federal resources to struggling schools, whether or not those schools already receive federal dollars. Provisions that give states more flexibility in educating their English learners in the manner that best meets the needs of each individual student. Provisions that ensure that parents have more information about how their child's public school is doing and set clear guidelines for what states and districts must disclose to parents and when they must disclose it. And provisions that promote transparency by preventing states from manipulating their graduation rates or data on how much money they're investing in each student. These important provisions were carefully crafted over the course of a year with input from teachers and school system leaders and student advocates. Both Republicans and Democrats should support these provisions. I think we all know what's going on here. Betsy DeVos is the new Secretary of Education. Congressional Republicans have decided that they want to hand over the keys to her with no restrictions whatsoever. The resolutions we are debating today would give Secretary DeVos more freedom to push states in whatever direction she felt like. If you're a teacher in Tennessee or a principal in Massachusetts, you should be furious about that. Congress is about to scrap a year of hard work and a year of careful compromise in order to give Secretary DeVos a blank check. A blank check for Betsy DeVos. This is the same Secretary of Education who has never attended a public school, never taught in a public school, never led a public school. This is the same Secretary of Education who proved to the world during her confirmation hearing that she doesn't have a clue about public schools. This is the same Secretary of Education who still holds shady investments that could be hiding conflicts of interest. This is the same Secretary of Education who has used her vast fortune to advance her extreme privatization agenda. And this is the same Secretary of Education who Jeff Sessions and the Vice President of the United States had to drag across the finish line in an unprecedented, tie-breaking confirmation vote. She is the one the Senate Republicans want to give a blank check to figure out where she wants to drive public education, a blank check to push her radical privatization agenda. States and school districts are planning for the next school year right now. They're figuring out how to implement this law and improve the education of kids as I speak. They are doing heroes' work every day while Congress wastes time and creates more confusion. Handing this law over to an education secretary with no experience in public education, without any accountability rules to guide its implementation, is an insult. It is an insult to teachers, an insult to school leaders, and an insult to families everywhere. This is not a game. Congress should not be playing politics with the education of our children. Instead of disrupting the important work that states and districts are doing to educate our kids, Congress should get out of the way and let states finish what they've already started. Let them get to work. That's why I urge my colleagues to reject this resolution. Thank you, Mr. President.